A few weeks ago, I covered the case of Alonzo Brooks, which was featured on the show Unsolved Mysteries. Today's case is another one from Unsolved Mysteries, but from the 70s before Netflix picked it up. The mystery of what really happened to Don Kemp is actually the first case in the first ever episode, and it's a bizarre one. If you generally enjoyed mysteries, true crime, disappearances, and the occasional conspiracy, please feel free to subscribe for more content like this. Donald, or Don Kemp, born in 1947, was a successful advertising executive in New York City prior to a car accident which left him with debilitating injuries and took 3 years to recover from. During this time, Don seemed to make quite the transformation. He became disinterested in materialism, so sold off most of his possessions, and according to family and friends, became withdrawn, though not completely, as it sounds like he still had some level of contact with them. He quit his advertising job and became very interested in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, even spending the majority of his free time writing a book about the matter. He grew tired of living in New York and after a while decided to move to Jackson Hole, Wyoming. On his journey, he stopped at several sites on the Lincoln Heritage Trail, one of which being a museum in Cheyenne. He stayed here for a couple of hours and didn't speak to anyone. After he left the museum, the staff realised that he'd left his briefcase, which contained important items such as his driving glasses, travelling checks, diary and address book. Don did call the museum later to ask about his briefcase. They confirmed that they had it and he said he'd be back for it, though he never returned, and that would be the last time anyone ever heard from him. The next morning, on the 16th of November 1982, at around 10 a.m, 2 highway patrolmen came across Don's SUV, still running and abandoned in the middle of the road.
Neither of us has seen anything like this. The vehicle was left 40 miles from any town on an off-ramp, running, stuff strung out of it, the doors open, a relatively new vehicle, not one that someone would just leave. Run a 28, 29 on it, Mike, and see if it's not stolen. We think he was alone because there was only room for one person in the vehicle. It was so full of camping gear and papers and briefcases and suitcases that I don't know how you could get another person in the vehicle.
I couldn't find any information to suggest whether or not it seemed like he was heading back to the museum. Footprints were found in the snow leading out into the empty prairie.
What would inspire anybody to walk out through that prairie in the middle of winter? We considered possibly someone under medication that didn't know what they were doing due to the medication or being out of the medication. Possibly that would affect them to the point of where they would just walk out into the middle of nowhere.
Well, I think he was mentally disturbed. He was having problems, mental problems, and possibly some health problems, and he just couldn't cope with it.
Searches were conducted. A duffel bag belonging to Don was found containing soap, a teapot, and clothes. The footprints from the road led to an abandoned barn around 6 miles away, where 3 of Don's socks were found, and evidence that someone had attempted and failed to start a fire.
There was a snowdrift completely around the barn, and no tracks leading away from it. I looked closer at the snowdrift and discovered that somebody had turned around and stepped backwards and walked backwards, stepping in their same tracks to try to hide their trail coming in the barn. And it just seemed like someone was trying to hide from us.
I guess there's no way to know for sure that those footprints actually were Don's, but it is presumed. It's pretty weird that it seemed that he'd walked back on his own footsteps. I don't even know how they determined that, and there's no information to suggest how far they were retraced. Was it the whole 6 miles? I mean, that seems kind of unlikely. I'm not even sure why you'd do that unless he just really didn't want to be found, but it just kind of seems like a lot of debatably unnecessary effort to go to. After 3 days, the search had to be called off due to a severe blizzard. Everyone involved in the search agreed that if Don had not died previously, that he would have definitely died in that blizzard. Some would say this is a pretty open and shut case. I mean, a man starts acting strangely, pretty much transforms into a whole new person, decides to up and leave his old life behind, and ends up leaving his car abandoned in the middle of the road, never to be seen again. For whatever reason, it seems like he left of his own accord. But this is where it gets a bit weird. Don's mother, Mary Kemp, was adamant that her son would not have wandered off. He had no history of mental illness, and it was extremely out of character. She believed he may have met with foul play. However, there were a couple of possible sightings of Don 5 months later in Casper, Wyoming. I couldn't find the exact location where Don's car was found, though Casper is around a 2.5-mile drive from Cheyenne, where Don visited the museum. I would imagine the car was found somewhere on or near this route. Someone reported seeing him at a travelling exhibit of Abraham Lincoln memorabilia, and a bartender at a local tavern claimed to distinctly remember serving Don. Normally I don't put too much weight into sightings from strangers. I mean, if you don't know a person well and they don't really have any distinctive features, it'd be easy to mistake them for someone else. Though it is interesting that 2 separate people would report sightings in the same area, one being at an exhibit which Don almost definitely would have wanted to attend. Around the same time, a co-worker and close friend of Don's returned home from holiday to find 6 messages from Don on her answering machine.
I'm absolutely certain that it was his voice. And it was a very brief message. I'd like to speak to you again. Call me and a phone number. The next day, I called, asked to speak to Don. A man answered the phone. He said that Don was out. I'm convinced he holds the clue to what really happened to Don.
I'm not sure if the clip was edited for time's sake or if this source is wrong, but according to wiki2.org, when a man answered the phone and Judy asked if Don was there, he replied yes, then almost immediately said no. When Judy asked the man to ask Don to call her back, he replied yeah and hung up, but of course she never got a call back. The calls were traced back to a trailer in, what a surprise, Casper, Wyoming, owned by a man named Mark Dennis. Matt claimed the phone company must have made a mistake or that someone else had used his phone without him knowing, as he had no idea who Don was and claimed to have never made the calls. He agreed to take a polygraph test, and investigators were satisfied that he was not involved in Don's disappearance. Mary had her suspicions, however, and travelled to Wyoming to question Mark herself. He refused to speak to her and hired an attorney before abruptly moving away 3 weeks after he was initially questioned by the police. Hiring an attorney doesn't necessarily mean someone's guilty, but it does look suspicious that he suddenly moved away from the area not long after he was questioned. This could have just been to avoid harassment from Mary though, who apparently showed up a few times. What's interesting is that Judy's phone number was unlisted, meaning that it couldn't have been found in a phone book or anything, so this couldn't just be some random person playing a joke. Of course we do know that Don left his address book at the museum, so some people wonder if someone found that and then just called the number as a prank. But considering the book was not taken, it would have had to have been a member of staff, which just seems pretty unlikely. Apparently whoever called Judy actually left their phone number for Judy to call them back, which again wouldn't seem very likely if it was a prank. Nearly 4 years after Don's disappearance, his body was found just a few miles from where his car had been abandoned. It was determined that he had died shortly after his car was found, possibly in the blizzard. However, the discovery of the body only really led to more questions. He was found in an open space that had already been thoroughly searched. The autopsy showed no signs of foul play, though I wonder if that completely rules it out. He'd supposedly been dead for well over 3 years at this point. I can't imagine anything more than bones remaining. So what really happened to Don Kemp? Clearly investigators believe that Don was not a victim of foul play, which kind of makes sense. I mean, there's no evidence whatsoever to tie anyone else to this. There's no physical evidence suggesting that anyone else actually killed him. The most popular theory is that Don suffered some kind of breakdown and wandered off into the wilderness, where he died of exposure. As we already know, he'd been acting strange before his disappearance and had made some pretty abrupt, huge life changes. According to a newspaper at the time, Don had also spoken of gathering the masses and starting a cult. Other sources online state that he was very interested in seances and thought he had channeled the spirit of Abraham Lincoln. This could all be a sign that his mental health was declining, but I'm not too sure if this was confirmed. It wasn't mentioned in Unsolved Mysteries, and I don't know why they'd leave that out if it was true. If that is true though, or even just based on this sudden perceived enlightenment in his mind, I have wondered about the possibility of him maybe starting to take drugs and having a bad trip on that day or something. It's also been suggested that he might have headed out to commit suicide, though the clothes, teapot and soap that was found kind of suggests that he might have been planning to stay out there for some period of time. It's also extremely difficult to speculate on someone's mental health not knowing them personally and not being an expert myself. The theories relating to any of that as well just don't really explain the phone calls. Also, assuming that Don needed glasses for driving, how on earth did he even drive to that location without them? And surely he'd realise as soon as he got to his car after leaving the museum that he'd left them behind. I honestly can't think of a logical explanation for him leaving his bag and not realising till well after he left the museum. Some people suggest that he was abducted from the museum. Maybe he left his bag behind as some kind of clue or something. But this theory just kind of seems a little bit far-fetched considering where his car and his belongings were found. Especially considering it was noted that no one else could have fit in his car because it was so full of his belongings. There's also theories out there relating to identity theft. I'm not sure if they could be 100% positive that the body found was actually Don's, but if there's any doubt, maybe there's a possibility that the body belonged to someone who Don took the identity of and he's actually still alive out there somewhere. It's also been noted that Don strongly resembled Mark Dennis. I wonder if that's relevant at all. I couldn't actually find a photo of Mark Dennis myself, so it's a little bit hard to say in my personal opinion, but that's just what I've heard online. Don faking his own death would explain the sightings, though it just sounds a little bit far-fetched. Though I guess back in the 80s it would be a lot easier to do that kind of thing than it would be today. The only other theory is that Don's death was as a result of foul play. Don leaving his car running in the middle of the road could indicate some kind of sudden breakdown, but it also could be explained by something spooking him. Maybe I've just watched too many horror films, but maybe someone approached him with a gun and told him to get out of the car. Maybe it was some kind of robbery gone wrong or something. Maybe even a hitchhiker lured him in. This wouldn't explain Don's items being found up to 6 miles away though. Is a random assailant going to go to that kind of length to make it look like Don voluntarily disappeared? Maybe Don was not targeted specifically, though simply just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some people don't believe that though and don't think it could have been just a random attack. According to MysteriousUniverse.org, some of Don's belongings, including notes with his research, have been stolen in the years after his disappearance. Apparently several people who had been in possession of some of these documents died under suspicious circumstances, one in a motorcycle incident and another in a house fire. If this is true, that's either a huge coincidence or extremely suspicious. The theory goes that Don found out information that certain people didn't want getting out, and since he planned to put that information in his book, they killed him before he had chance, as well as other people who may have received that information. But again, none of this explains the phone calls, unless Mark Dennis was actually the one to kidnap Don and held him at his property for a while where Don managed to escape for a moment and call someone and then he was killed after this. But it's all just very bizarre and none of it really makes sense. I'm not really sure what to make of this case. If it wasn't for the phone calls, I'd probably just without a doubt say that no foul play was involved. But I can't think of any logical explanation behind the phone calls. It all just seems too coincidental. That said, I can't think of a foul play theory that explains everything either. A few sources have stated that Mary actually went back on her theory of foul play, eventually just deciding that he must have just wandered off and got lost, though it sounds like she may have gone back on that later again. Sadly, she died in 2014, possibly, at least in her mind, never really knowing what happened to her son. If you have any information on the disappearance and death of Don Kemp, you can still submit a tip on Unsolved.com. I'll leave a link in the description. So I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. As I say, I really can't make my mind up on this one, though I do think there is enough to question the official findings. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next Thursday in a new video.